Hello everybody, how you guys doing? This is Rene Lemuel González Berrio, Boy Fabemi, Onichango, Omba, Anya, Omo Odu, Obeate. Showcasing this new shirt. I actually bought this one in Puerto Rico. I had not worn it before. It's got like this weird hypnotic type of thing. So I'm going to hypnotize you with information today. But I'm doing the fourth installment, fourth episode of Diasporas and Origins. I've been doing this series basically examining the literature and other information essentially after the trail of the roots of Ifa. The previous videos, for those that have been following episode 2, episode 3, etc., essentially, and from episode 1, essentially part from this basic premise. The idea or the theory that Ifa does not come from Nigeria, that the Yorubas did not do this. Now, I thought I was, as they say, discovering something, almost like Columbus was discovering something. But no, Columbus didn't discover anything, and I didn't discover anything either. In the last episode, in episode, I believe 3, we started examining evidence of the 16 major geomantic signs, what the Nigerians or the Ifa practitioners or Fa practitioners would call the 16 majors. Obe, Oye, Kung, Iwori, Odi, Rosowani, you guys know the rest. These 16 major signs have been seen in Hebrew divination, Muslim divination, Chinese divination, European divination, and there's different stages. We'll get to that. But we've seen all these divinations, cultures. All these cultures have had these divination systems at some point in time. Some of them still practice them. It's possible that some don't anymore, or it has been highly reduced. But the reality is that we have evidence that these 16 major divination signs were present in other cultures previous to Yorubaland. So let's get to it. Let's not waste time. We're going to start with, and everything, but what I'm going to say is I don't assert things to just say things. I'm bringing in information that's been in the books already for 40, 50 years. Some of these books were published in the 1980s, like Philip Dubois' book and stuff like that. I think Stephen Skinner was 1987. Some of them are even older, 1940 and 1960 for the Bernard Mapoil and for William Bacon. This is established literature for 40 or 50 years. In Spanish, we say descubriendo el agua tibia, discovering the warm waters. Another way of saying you're discovering something that's been there for a long time already. This documentation has already been done. The consensus across anthropological people is that Ifa was taught by the Muslim Islamic geomancy to the Yorubas. And let's start with this. Let's start first with a declaration from the actual Alafin de Oyo. We showed this, I believe, in one of the old videos, but I'm going to recap here. Basically, the evidence that the Alafin of Oyo, I'm going to show it right here, world through a letter. Two things. One, that through the evolution and migration, the Ifa divination system of drawing marks on the sand or camwood with Arabic origin, dun, 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 incorporated into their stories and systems various tales, plays, aspects, and religious structures and functions of the Yoruba Orisha mythology, as the Itan stories, complex songs, histories, and other cultural concepts which make up the Yoruba race. So he's basically saying that it was through evolution and migration. The migration of who? Arab traders and other groups that made contact with the Yorubas. The Ifa divination was of Arabic origin. But to make it even more plain, the new divination system, not the old divination system, not something created in Nigeria, the new divination system called Ifa entered. When you say the word entered, that doesn't mean created. You could have, if the Alafin meant that it was natively created, it was said the new divination system evolved in Nigeria. It would have said some word that said it was natively developed. But no, the Alafin of Oyo, of Balamidi, Olayiwola, Adejimi, with this signature there, he said really clearly the new divination system called Ifa entered through the town of Ota to the Oba Alade from Alado, the first Yoruba king to receive beaded crown from the Alafin, who introduced Ifa to the Alafin. It was the Oba Alade who introduced it to the Alafin. And he finishes, Ifa divination system was properly accepted among the Orisha pantheon of the Yorubas by the Alafin of Iran when? The 16th century. I have a very clear statement by the Alafin, not your regular corner guy in some marketplace in Ota or in Ekiti or in Ijebu. It was the Alafin, the highest sovereign, at least cultural ruler of the Oyo people, and a major figure in the Yoruba pantheon of leaders, let's put it that way, admitting in 2016 that Ifa was a new system taught from Arabic origin. He very clearly said Arabic origin taught to the Yorubas through the Alade of Alado to the Alafin of Inran in the 16th century. Okay, we're going to get to that. So we have that admission. In case anybody says, all these anthropological leaders, these are a bunch of Europeans, they don't know anything, they've never been in Nigeria, they need to come study in Nigeria. No, well, what are you going to say about this guy? This guy was as a Nigerian as it come. It was the Alafin of Oyo. He was a Yoruba man himself. But we're going to get to that, okay? So we start with documentation from the book by Philip Dubois. Let's start with him. And Philip Dubois wrote a book called Geomancy. You guys can look it up online. I think it's usually in French, but there's a Spanish version of it. I'm going to have to do translation for you guys because a lot of you guys don't speak Spanish. Gotta learn other languages. If I can do it, you guys can do it. So here we go. Let's start with translation of the the French version, because this is the Spanish version of the book, but it's what I can read. So what we have here is that there was evidence in the Islamic world of an anonymous treaty of Siglo XII of the 12th century that includes or pretends to include Christ or Jesus Christ marking signs upon the ground. That's what it says in parentheses in an episode with the adulterous woman. Now, I don't believe that Jesus Christ was Babalao or was marking signs, anything, or making a divination. I mean, who knows? There's a claim that for a long time Jesus Christ left in the Bible and he comes back when he's 30 years old. And some people have argued that that was the period he went to Egypt or went to the Arab world and studied with elders or greats and stuff like that and learned divination. Who knows? We don't know. We have no evidence to support that basis. But what we do have is evidence that there was already at least a document in the 12th century in the Arab world that clearly was making statements of the geomantic figures and that Christ himself, or at least some figure, was doing markings on the ground. That's evidence alone that there was sand divination or geomancy, the idea of divining upon the earth, geo, earth, mancy. And that's the first thing, but not just any type of geomancy, because people will say, well, you can make any mark on the ground, and that doesn't mean it was the Ifa divination system. Well, we got more info. I got a lot for you guys today. So there was a mention here it says, among the prophets, it talks about Alusi having a person who practiced hat, or kat. It was basically a marking of a figure, of the mother figure in the sand. So what are the mother figures? It talks here about manuscripts later relating the revelation of 4 mother original figures. Now, jumps up to one's eyes like, okay, what are these mother figures? What are we talking about? So I got that for you guys too. On page 24 of the book of Philip Dubois, Geomancy, we have the 4 mother figures. Have you ever seen these guys before? Pam, pam, pam. Ogbe, Oyekun, Odi, Iwori. And if it wasn't anymore, it talks here a little bit about the mythology that, the Archangel Gabriel taught Idris the idea of geomancy. So there's this little bit of the background story of the mythology. I'm not too convinced about that mythology as a scientific expert and investigator, but we do have that as the official Arab explanation of how you guys get the geomancy. Oh, the Archangel Gabriel taught Idris and so forth, right? But the more important thing for me is the evidence that the Arabs already had the Mejis. They already had the markings, all of them, all 16, but these are the 4 mother figures. And in case there's a confusion of whether or not there was a relationship to it, the author makes a clear divination relationship, saying these 4 mother original figures or signs, we can find them among the Fa in the Yoruba, where they're the 4 roots of the world which are placed upon the cross, the 4 cardinal points. Look at Ifatre. When we look at Lukumi Ifa and Nigerian Ifa, and Ababalao always salutes the tray, they go Atiwaye, Atiwaoro, Atilo de Aticanteri, Oriopong, which corresponds to, I believe, Iwori Meji, Elese Opong, which corresponds to Odi Meji, Otun Opong, which is the right, which is where basically the east, where the sun comes out. That's where we have a drawing of the sun, and where the sun sets to the west, which is Oyekun Meji, the darkness. The sun represents Ogbe, which is the beginning light of everything, the expansion of things, and the west is the moon, where the sun sets, darkness, the contraction of everything. So these are symbolic in nature, but they're present in our divination. Where do we get it? Where do the Lukumi Ifa people get it? Where do the Nigerian Ifa people get it? The Arabs. The Arabs had the 16 major signs, but we're gonna get to that. We got more. I got a lot more. It's not just this and that's it. No. We got a lot of other stuff here. So we have the book of Philippe Dubois of the Asian geomantic systems, the Chinese in particular, the concept of yang and yin, the balance of darkness and light, the on and off, female and male. In yang, it's either marked as a sign, a one little line, one long line, or a dot, or it's marked as two dots, the yin, or a line broken in half. And that's how you have the binary system. And what do we have up here? We have the markings of the Meiji right under the Chinese, equal geomantic figures. The Chinese already had the concept of the 16 major geomantic signs and the concept of binarism. The Chinese culture is way older than the Yoruba. Yes, I understand that primitive African man existed before all the other cultures, but primitive man did not have civilizations. Primitive man did not create this. The first civilizations to create this information developed in Asia. Okay, they were the first civilizations to have developed enough, enough civilizational development to be able to dedicate some of the people some of its time to be able to discuss theological or geomantic type of concepts. Primitive African man would have been concerned with subsistence, would have been concerned with hunting and gathering. In fact, not even agriculture. And anybody that has done any anthropological or any type of studies about the development of human society can always tell you that the point of development of civilization is when you have irrigation and agriculture. If you don't have agriculture, you can't have the creation of food. If you don't have the mass creation of food through agriculture, you can't free human beings to be able to dedicate themselves to other employees or professions. You would have never had the development of religious specialists, geomantic diviners, and that type of professions if you first didn't have the development of agriculture. And primitive man in Africa did not have that. The Yoruba people, before Oduduwa and 1300 after Christ, were not organized. There was no civilization there to speak of, to say. I mean, they had their city-states, but they didn't have the development to be able to develop this type of divination system. The Chinese did. The Chinese and the Muslims had those civilizations previous to the Yoruba. We're going to get there. The most important thing to understand here is we've already seen that the Chinese had the 16 geomantic figures. We're going to get more for him. So let's continue. And I got here for you guys. This is the geomantic 16 signs around the circle. Have you guys ever seen something like this before? The idea, and for at least for the Nigerians and for the Lukumifa, Ogbe would be over here. Ogbe, Oyekun, Iwori, Odi. But for the Chinese, they are also in the cardinal points. Ogbe, Oyekun. I believe this is, this might be Odi. I believe this is Odi. This is Odi and that's Iwori. And all the other signs around them. And they correspond to what it says, Spanish situated are the 4 cardinal points, the 4 primordial mothers in the tetragram, showing which ones are the signs that correspond to those 4. Then you can see them in the squares. The Chinese civilization was older than any of the Yoruba civilization. They already were working with the 16 geomantic figures. The concept of the 16 great geomantic figures was already present in Chinese culture. And it was already present in Muslim culture, as we have seen from the statement that in the 12th century, they already had written text that had revealing Jesus Christ, marking signs, signs in the sand. Let's get to it. There's a lot more here. All right. So here, it says around 1000 after Christ, when geomancy penetrates the Occident, basically penetrates Europe. So this is proof right here that by 1000 after Christ, geomancy or Muslim geomancy was penetrating the West, particularly, and over here. 1 or 2 centuries before that, in Almeria, which is the actual Almeria, one of the first ports of the Emirate of Cordoba in Spain. 2 centuries before 1000, okay, if you continue the writing, 1 or 2 centuries before the entering or the penetrating of the West by Islamic geomancy, already the Emirate of Cordoba, the area of Cordoba, España, of Spain, had Islamic geomancy. So we can start, in these books, we can start situating the idea of, okay, when was it that Muslim geomancy started spreading into Europe? Around 900, 1000, 1100, or 1200, around there. Those are the years. Give or take 100 or 200 years. It's around there, okay? So we already know that the Muslims, had the 16 figures for those during that time period. Let me situate the Yorubas at the same time. Odudua had not even arrived yet to the Yoruba land areas. It is estimated that Odudua arrived between 1300 after death and 1350 after death, and that's when he begins the process of forming the Yoruba Empire as we know it, taking all the city-states, conquering them, and creating one people, or the concept of one people, because they were all separate polities or separate tribes, let's put it that way. The Alafin of Oyo says that by the 16th century, which will be the 1500s, by the 16th century is when Ifa begins to enter through Alta, 200 years later, after the arrival of Odudua. We have reports here of Islamic geomancy in Cordova, Spain, in 1900s, 1000, 1100, 1200. I ask you, what comes first, 900 to 1200, or 1300 to 1500? Who had it first, the Nigerians or the Arabs? Because these are documented proofs. These are things that have already been in documents that have been able to be dated. It's impossible that the native Nigerians were the founders of Ifa. It's impossible to it. They would have never been able to develop the same 16 major signs all of a sudden out of the blue without the presence of anybody else. And we're going to get to that in the next book. Without the presence of anybody else, they developed the same exact 16 major signs, whereas the Arabs already had it for 400 years. Kind of don't make no sense. But we're going to get to that. So the next image shows us the map in Philip Dubois of his belief of how geomancy spread around the world. What's interesting is the map says Islamic sources, Chinese sources. The only things on the page that says source is those two. All the other ones talk about Arab and Morocco geomancy, Provençal geomancy, Arab geomancy in those areas in Cordova and the Caliphate of Cordova, geomancy, Arab and Byzantine geomancy, Brazilian geomancy. So there's different geomantic systems, but the only ones that have the label fuente, source, are the Islamic and the Chinese. And it says particularly the Sufi Arabs, the Sufi Muslims were the ones who developed this information. So in Philip Dubois' consideration, it comes out from China, spreads to the Arab world. From the Arab world, it at the same time spreads down to Shigidi, Madagascar. There you have it, the Shigidi's geomancy. And then it spreads through over here. Let me use the mouse so you guys can see it a little better. Whee! So it spreads over here. Let's start again. China goes over here. From the Arab world, goes down to Madagascar for Shigidi. It spreads to Egypt. It spreads to the north of Africa, where we see a lot of the Maghreb and Sahara Desert Araum divination, which is the Islamic geomancy. And then it spreads down to where? Ife and Lagos, Porto Nuevo, Ivory Coast, and basically feeds all the geomantic systems that are very similar. Afa, Fa, Ifa, Iha, etc. And then it goes over to, obviously, Brazilian geomancy, Orisha geomancy. This map is missing, of course, an arrow this way to Cuba, but basically we know that's how it went. So when I posited, I made a logical assumption that this is exactly how it would have gone, that it would have come from India or China, it would have gone to the Arab world, and from the Arab world it would have spread to Europe and to Africa at the same time. That was my theory, using my logic as a person who has studied enough to have enough knowledge to make what's called an educated guess. That was my educated guess. It was proven. It was proven in a book in this book has got already 40 years, 1987. This anthropological research was already in the books for 40 years. I just didn't know it. I had to get hunkered down and do the hard work of research, which is what I'm doing for you guys, to help you guys kind of stimulate you to read these books. But we already have an general idea of how geomancy spread out. Asia to the Arab world to Africa and to Europe, and from there to the rest of the world. Okay? All right, so let's move on to the next one. The next book is Stephen Skinner. Stephen Skinner wrote a book called Divination by Geomancy. I think it's called Terrestrial Astrology or something like that. But in the book of Skinner, let's start this gold mine. Skinner was, didn't mince words. And the good thing is it's in English, so you can read it with me. Says, geomancy has come therefore to have several meanings. We have one, a system derived from Arabic sand divination, which developed into African systems of divination by earth, nuts, and beads. The get-go, from page number 6, the introduction, what do you call it? Skinner goes for the jugular. It's a system derived from Arabic sand cutting, which is basically realm divination, which developed into African systems of divination by earth and nuts. There you go. I could leave the video here and that's it. We're done. It's right there. But no, I got a lot more for you guys, okay? So, let's get to it. The same book, Stephen Skinner, Divination by Geomancy. We have a map. And let's take a look at his map, his idea of where it came from. Now, in his conception, Asian divination systems, the ones we saw in China, went and fed a little bit of the Madagascar information, but it didn't populate into the Arab world. What he thinks is that separately, the Muslims had their own development of the 16 major signs in realm. And the realm then spreads out to Africa through Egypt to Darfur and hits where? The areas of Ifa, Nigeria, Dahomey, Togo, Ghana, but it also from the top, basically all from the north of Africa, there's different routes that populate. The Arab traders come down from different routes into what's West Africa here. And from there, obviously, it goes to Voodoo, to the USA, to Haiti, to Cuba, and all the different ATRs that we have seen in the New World. But the geomancy of Ram also goes where? To the European systems, where it develops the European geomancy, and European geomancy then later comes over to the north of the United States, where we've seen evidence, for example, of Druid-based and Wiccan-based, the geomantic systems informed with the 16 major signs. So this is the idea. The idea of Skinner is that the Chinese fed Sigidi, but also the Arab realm fed the Sigidi Madagascar divination system, which uses the 16 major signs as well. That's also proof, again, because this is disconnected. The Yorubas didn't have boats to come over here, okay? Let's be real. So this is disconnected from the African continent, and yet you find the 16 major signs here. How is that possible? Because it wasn't the Yorubas who developed Ifa. Ifa is not of Nigerian development. They received it just like all the other ones. They received it there. The Igalas received it there. The Edo received it there. The Ewe received it there. The Fon received it there. The Yoruba received it. They all receive and create their own diasporas, their own religious systems, incorporating the geomantic ideas of what? Realm. I'm not saying the Nigerians didn't have their own ideas, their own songs, their own rituals, their own orishas, their own ebo, their own verses created by their Ewe poets. Yes, they have that. But the divination system, the archiving system, that's not their creation. They didn't create Ifa. That comes from realm. That's the purpose of this video. We're going to continue. So we have the next page, boink, the roots of geomancy. And it says really clear that in the studies that have been done, with one or two few exceptions, even within Africa, there are few studies with one or two exceptions, notably René Trautmann, Bernard Monpoil, and J.C. Hubbard, which even appeared to realize that Ifa and Fa on the west coast of Africa are exactly parallel with Shigidi in Madagascar. Exactly parallel. And we're talking an island where no Yoruba ever went to, because the Yorubas didn't make the trek across Africa and cross on boats to get to Madagascar. It's exactly parallel with Shigidi and Madagascar, and that both stem from Realm, a common Arab origin. Dun, dun, dun. Let's continue. In this page, we have on the bottom, there was some Greek documentations that were talking about the issue of geomancy. You guys can read the book later and go through that. But the important thing was the fact that portions of the practice of geomancy first appear in Greek manuscript translated from the Arabic, and not any classical sources, indicate quite definitively that the practice was of what? Dun, 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 Arab origin rather than Greek origin. So we have that on page 15 of the same book by Skinner. Then we have on page 22. To return to the tracing the expansion of geomancy from the Muslim world, it would seem to have occurred in three directions. First, Africa southwards across the Sahara to the Gulf of Guinea. Then it talks about basically through the Red Sea, through the Indian Ocean to Madagascar. And the third, from Muslim Spain to the rest of Europe. So it's talking about the tracing of when did it arrive to Europe and the Gulf of Guinea. Around the 16th, what was it that the Alafino Vayo said? In the 16th and 17th centuries, the Alafin Oyo said that Ifa penetrated Ota. When? 16th century. We have another book making the same claim. The Alafin of Oyo was not wrong. To the New World of the Americas, by which time, and this is important for a lot of New World practitioners who ask, how come there's no Arab divination now, or there's no evidence of any Muslim aspects? It had lost many of its essentially Muslim features. So that was already considered by Skinner in his 1987 investigation. Let's continue here. So here we talk about Ram and the idea that Ram is sand cutting, how it's done. Basically, it talks about how do you do it, repeating the process to produce the basic 16 geomantic figures, blah, 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 blah. But what's important is that sand cutting was and is a widespread form of geomancy practiced by many Islamic groups in both West and North Africa. Its similarities to the Dahomey divination system, and here we go to the next page, of Fa and the Yoruba Ifa were first noted by Fisher in 1929 and later elaborated on by Monteil, Troutman, and Shield, and most importantly Bernard Maupoil in 1943, who also drew attention to the similarities with Madagascan Shigiri divination. So we're talking about that the anthropologists realized that there's a similarity between Islamic geomancy realm with the Fa and Ifa divination systems of the Dahomey and Yoruba people, and also Shigiri of Madagascar. And I make the same claim. How is it possible that the Yorubas suddenly developed in the 1100, 1200 after death of Christ, divination systems separate or native born, let's put it that way, in Nigeria, separate from the Muslims, cross the entire part of South Africa, cross the waters, get on what boats? What boats did they build? What port were they flying out of Eastern Africa? Because in order to be able to make that trek, you got to make a big boat. Madagascar is quite far away in miles from Africa. And make it all the way to Madagascar and feed the Shigiri divination there too. Now, the excuse a lot of people are going to say is that, well, Rene in Madagascar, they had traders that went over to the African continent and they traded with the Nigerians, and that's how the Shigiri people learned of Ifa, because they took it back from the Yorubas back to Madagascar. Really? We're going to ignore the elephant in the room of the Arab migrations and the Arab traders. We're going to get to that, okay? And it's basically the consensus. You've already seen that in the documentation of Skinner. But over here, although this system of the Alufa, they had their own Muslim-inspired divination system in the West. In the West Africa. Talks about that there was further evidence of the direct connection between realm and the divination systems of the Yoruba comes from the presence among the Yoruba of a form of sand cutting called by them Iyanrin Tite, which is practiced by Muslim diviners known as Alufa, who often referred to the technique as Hati Ramli or Atimi for short. The name of the 16 basic figures, there they are, clearly differ from those of Ifa, but correspond to those given by Asnati. The order in which these figures were recently given by Anofa, a native of Saria, is identical with that in which they are enlisted by Asnati. Although this system of the Alufa may be a recent introduction of Islamic geomancy, the local parallels in practice between it and Ifa help to confirm the Muslim, origin of the latter. What's the latter? Ifa. Help to confirm the Muslim origin of the latter. The practitioners of Ifa divination rely upon extensive verses which are memorized and recited in response to the generation of a particular geomantic figure. Traces of those verses exist in what? Islamic realm. I remember there was not one of the Ashesha's cosplayers. I'm not going to name his name because I don't want to get him in trouble. But he knows who I'm talking about. Está en Puerto Rico. I'm going to say it that way. I'll leave it right there. I love him. He's a great guy, and I respect his Isheshe tradition. I respect that he's chosen that tradition of Ifa to study. We're all brothers in Ifa. I don't have a problem with that. But one of the things he has said is there verses in Realm? I wish I had that image of, Will Smith. I'm saying it right there. But it continues the investigation, but not the propitiatory sacrifices which are of such central importance to Ifa. On the positive side, sand cutting is sometimes used rather than the throwing of seeds to generate a figure in both Ifa and Realm, and the whole mathematics of addition of odds and evens, the shapes of the figures, and some meanings are identical. Now here's the important part. Burton and Maipoil, two other anthropologists, both came to the conclusions that Ifa, Fa divination, and Shigidi, the Madagascar one, are all derived from what? Islamic geomancy, okay? Considering the trade routes and general expansion of Islam, together with the incredible internal similarity, this thesis seems to be inescapable. A final piece of evidence is produced by Ellis, 1894, who says that the divination board used by the Ifa diviners, that it is exactly similar to those used by children in Muslim schools in lieu of slates, about 2 feet long and 8 or 9 inches broad, thus reinforcing the evidence for the Islamic origin of Ifa. Can you guys say it with me? Not native nor Nigerian origin of Ifa, the Islamic origin of Ifa. Let's all take a breather, process that, because that's the hardest part for a lot of people who have wedded their entire self-identity and their entire practice of Ishashe under the idea that they left Lukumi because they wanted to go searching for purity, the source and origin of things. But what if I told you, what if these authors, better said, told you Nigeria is not the origin? Where does that place us? It means that your practice of Ifa is a diaspora. It means that Dahomey, Afa, and Fa are diasporas. It means that Lukumi Ifa is a diaspora of a diaspora. It just means that. It doesn't mean that you can't practice Isese Ifa. It doesn't mean that if you're a Bokono, you can't practice Bokono Ifa. We all have every culture takes Islamic geomancy realm, made it their own, created their own diaspora, and they're completely valid. But what we can't say anymore is that Nigeria was the origin of Ifa. That I think we need to accept as investigators. That's all I'm asking for. I'm not saying that you can't practice Isese Ifa. I'm not saying that you don't prefer it. I prefer Lukumi Ifa. Somebody else prefers Isese Ifa. Somebody else prefers Dahomey Afa. That's great. But we can't say anymore that the Nigerians developed Ifa. That Nigerocentric or Yoruba-centric fallacy and fantasy is completely discounted by the literature, by the consensus of all of these anthropologists. Burton, Ellis, Malpoil, Hartman, Shield, Philip Dubois, Stephen Skinner, and as we're going to see later, Emily Savage Smith. I think it's pretty clear. Okay, so we're going to go on to the next one. Here's some information. 4. To Togo and Ghana, it says the practice is carried across the Sahara and into the tropical areas of Dahomey, Togo, and Ghana. The sand which was previously used to generate the figures becomes the powder on the diviner's board. So this is showing how it used to be marked on the earth, and then it started being marked on the board. Okay, and it marks over here that together with this adaptation, the unique verbal heritage of the Yoruba contributed material. This is the thing that my friend Jose was talking about. Did the Yoruba contribute anything? Yes, they did. Once it arrived to them and they created their own diaspora. The unique verbal heritage of the Yoruba contributed material to the complex set of verses designed as a mnemonic to aid the practitioner to memorize the interpretations of the various combinations, important, of geomantic figures passed on to them by what? Dun dun dun, Arab traders. Yes, the Yoruba did add things. Here, the Yorubas made it their own, just like the Cubans have made Ifa their own. There were verses that came from the Islamic tradition. The Yorubas created their own. Their Ewi poetas created known. Those new verses created or incorporated the already native practice of animal sacrifice, fruit sacrifice, food sacrifices. They created their own. They said, we're going to take this information and we're going to say that in Ogbe or Oyekumeji there was a story about such and such, and that you need to kill a rooster to solve the problem. That's the creation of the Yorubas. The Yorubas took that information that was not native to them. They were not the origin of the fountain, but they did take that information and add the information from their own native cults and created their own Ifa tradition, their own diasporic Ifa tradition, which is respectable. I'm not going against it. I'm saying it 1,000 times. I'm only simply saying that you can't say, oh, we created this is ours. Well, wait a minute. You're kind of forgetting the guys who taught it to you, the Arab traders. We're leaving them away from the picture. And what I'm insisting is that historically speaking, we got to respect that contribution. We can't keep claiming from the Isesa side, we are the origin and source. That is a lie. What you guys are origin and source is of your own diasporic tradition of Ifa. That's okay. You can also say, we fed you guys, Lukumi Ifa, with information. You are a derivative of us. Yes, you can say that. We can also argue on the Lukumi side, but we're not only exclusively a derivative of Yoruba Ifa, we also have Fonfa, and we also have Ewefa. And we also have Igala and Igbofa. We have other information from the Bantu, from the Abakwa, from other groups. We can also agree to that. And yes, we can agree that there's a large part that comes from the Yoruba. There is no problem with admitting that. But what we can't say, what we must all hold hands and agree on as practitioners of different diasporic Ifa traditions is Nigeria wasn't the source and the origin. The origin was the Arab traders. It was the Islamic geomancy. I don't say this. Burton, Ellis, Philip Dubois, Skinner, Bascom, Hartman, Shield, everybody else is saying it. The anthropological community is saying, the ones that have actually done these studies, the field studies, and proven themselves beyond the shadow of a reasonable doubt, let's put it that way. And for the 40 years, these books are old. This is not something that came out this year. These are over 40 years. This is even before Lukumi and Isheshe Ifa people started, bashing heads about who was first, who was second, who was more important, who was second, who's superior, who's inferior, who's origin, who's photocopy. Before that whole battle occurred, these guys already written these investigations. But people don't read books. I am glad to give all of these books. Any one that you see right here, ask me through WhatsApp. I will send it to you immediately. As soon as I get to my computer, I go, I'll send you the PDF. You guys are welcome to read these books. So we have here, continuing on at the end, it says, it seems, therefore, that this was when they're talking about where was it that the Islamic realm touched with the Yoruba. In trying to ascertain an exact point of contact at the bottom, it says, it seems, therefore, that this was the reception and subsequent diffusion point of the Islamic heritage of Rome. So again, Islamic heritage, Islamic geomancy starts touching upon the Yoruba and the Fon people in the city of where? Ife. So it's important to know, how did it make the contact? How did the Alafino Yo, when he says in the 15th century, Ifa starts to penetrate? Well, this is how they're doing it, okay? But the important thing here is he starts talking about the god of Ifa. Ifa, the oracle god, which is Orumila, supposed to have been the one who directed creation. And it talks about the story of the snail shell in a bag, blah, 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 blah. The mythology. But what's funny is the anthropological scientist says very clearly, rather than attributing Ifa divination to the Arab traders, the Yoruba people say that Ifa taught his method of divination to them while he was on earth. Anthropological people are not there for the bullshit. They're not there for the fantasy. What they're saying is, look, you created a story about this little black man who sat in a mountain in Igeti, and he taught everybody, and he came from heaven. And he would come back and forth from heaven, and he would go into a local, and he would go into the sea, and would go off to heaven, and that's how we got Ifa. Come on. We got brains here, right? That's what we use them for. And the anthropological scientists are saying, rather than attributing Ifa divination to the Arab traders, rather than having to swallow the bitter pill of saying, yeah, I kind of learned it from you, it was to create a mythology, that it was all native born, that it was the Orishas themselves who came down to the earth in Ife and populated everything and taught the Yoruba, and the Yorubas are the center of the world. We've seen this before in many cultures. I'm not blaming the Yoruba only for this. Every culture says, we're the first. We're the ones who came in. Our God created us and we were the first. We scientists don't deal with mythology. We deal with reality. The anthropological community is all in consensus that it was through Arab traders that Islamic geomancy nurtured and created Yoruba-style diasporic Ifa divination. That's okay. I'm saying 1,000 times, don't feel bad that you practice the diaspora. That is totally fine. All diasporic traditions are fine. Every culture makes Ifa their own. And every culture has a right to put their own sazon or their own cultural values, philosophies, songs, and ideas into the geomantic system. Because this is a universal geomantic information. We saw that it went through all of Asia, all of the Arab world, Europe. It's all over the world. It's a universal knowledge. But what we can't say it with me again, that Nigeria is the origin of Ifa. No, it cannot be that way. No, it wasn't that way. Oduduwa arrived in 1300 after death. They already had the 60 major signs in 900 and 1000 after death. And we have the proof in these books and the anthropological research. All of them agree. It was the Muslims who taught it to the Yoruba. We're going to continue to the next contribution to this. It says, it is obvious but with little examination that these two systems of divination, which are the Fonfa, basically, he's talking about the origin of the Fa oracle, the Yoruba, and over here, the Dahomey Fon, the god of Fa, is basically saying that these two divination systems, which have remarkably similar names, have a common source. What's the common source? Arabs. That's the common source between Fa as a deity in the Dahomey side and Orumila in the side of the Yorubas. Okay, so let's continue to the next step. The next thing was information. It says, it is interesting that Ogbe is considered the most powerful of all the figures, and Ogbemeji is spoken of as father of all the figures, as Ogbe corresponds to the Arabic figure Tariq, thought by the Arabs to be the prime figure from which all the others have been generated. The value of Ogbe as being the one that births all the other one is seen in the Arab geomancy. Further proof that the Arabs were the one that taught it to the Nigerians. The fact that we write from what? To left to right? No. To right to left. Who else writes right to left? The Arabs. Anybody kind of sat down for a moment to think, why do we read Ifa from right to left instead from left to right like almost every other culture in the world? Because it's influenced by the Arabs. Because it was taught by the Arabs. The Babalaos were taught Islamic geomancy and the idea of marking from right to left. They learned from the Arabs, and we still do it today all the way in diasporic Lukumi traditions. All right, here we have another reference. It says here, Wyndham and Price referred to the use of sand on the divining tray in Ife instead of termite powder, paralleling closely the sand which is basic to Islamic realm. Whatever substance is used, it is not merely considered as a convenient marking device, but part of the magic of Ifa, an assurance of a correct answer. In fact, dust in Arabic is afar, is probably the origin of the name of the god Ifa. Afar. Take away the R. What do we got? Afa, which is how the Ewe call it. Change the A to I. What do you got? Ifa. Even the name of the process of the divination system is a derivative of dust, of the process of dust. The Nigerians or the Yorubans have said that the concept of Ifa or the word Afa is to mark, atefar, to tefa, to actually mark a sign. So even if you take the Yoruba explanation of marking in a sand, or you take the Arab explanation of powder, both make reference to what? Marking into a powder, marking into a sand, marking into the earth. Okay, that's everything I wanted to show in terms of Skinner. Finally, we're going to look at Emily Savage Smith. Emily Savage Smith wrote a book called Islamic Geomancy and a 13th century divination device. Basically, the book is an examination of a machine that is available in the British Museum. You're going to see it here in the photos. And this machine was used for divination. And it's from the 13th century. The machine was dated exactly, to be exact, because it has an inscription on it talking about who was the maker and when did he make it, of 1241 to 1242 after death. We're talking at least over 60 to 100 years older than Oduduwa ever even reaching Yoruba land, lands, and at least a good 200 or 300 years before the Alafin of Oyo says that Ifa began to penetrate the Yoruba land areas through Ota. 300 or 400 years. We're going to get to that. But here we go. The first page. Islamic Geomancy by Emily Savage Smith. Page 9, it talks about, it does seem likely that a dustboard was employed by some geomancers, for the word tak occurs frequently in geomantic treatises, where it could mean either the abstract 16-place tableau or a dustboard on which the tableau of geomantic figures were produced. We have proof that geomantic figures were already marked upon trays, upon dustboards in the Arab world. The word tak occurs in medieval Arabic mathematical writings as a term for a small board lightly covered with sand. We already had texts in the Arab world talking about boards covered with sand before the Nigerians had it. Even there's mention of it in the 1001 Nights. It says here that there's several references to a geomantic tablet used with a stylus of brass to form the figures is probable evidence of the early use of a dustboard or tablet. The great Islamic literature of the 1001 Nights, which is a classic of Muslim Arabic literature, have reference to a dustboard where you mark signs on it. If that's not a tablero de Ifa, what is it? But the Nigerians taught this to the Arabs. The Yoruba people, who, I hate to say it this way, are still very primitive in their development of their society, where their areas are still not all paved, where they don't have working sewage systems, where hospitals are not available, where yellow fever and malaria explodes all the time. Those people who are now living that now in 2025, who would have been living worse living conditions in the 1300s and 1500s, those people were the ones who developed this great system of divination, while the Arabs had literature, had the 1001 Nights, had already divination trays with sand on it. Our logic tells us that it's impossible, that more primitive people taught the more advanced people how to divine upon boards. It's the other way around. The more advanced people taught the more primitive people about these things. And I don't say the word primitive to disrespect the Yoruba. I'm talking about purely from an examination of historical transmission of knowledge. There's always going to be a group that has more development or more civilization, and there's always going to be groups on the sides that are going to have less development. And the one that has more development teaches the one that have less development. Let's be real here, okay? Let's be examining with logic here. Now, in the Book of Islamic, on page 12, she basically makes an explanation of the first signs, right? And how it's divine. How is the process of realm? How is this? How you do a geomantic tableau? If you notice the signs, what are they? The same signs we know. Owani, Oche, Irete, Otrupong, Odi, Ogbe, Iwori, Oche. You know, it's the same signs. Don't tell me that the Yorubas developed this natively when you see another culture that was more advanced at the time have it 300 years before them. The same signs. Come on, let's use our logic here, people. Okay? Here's the machine. This machine is from 1241. Look at the development. Look at this incredibly developed machine. Look at all the dials. Look at the elaborate, intricate metal work and the design. This machine is a divination device of the Arab world. And if you go closely, you see the measures, you see the signs, the dots inside, and the dials. You see that the dials have an opening where you can mark the signs, where with the dials and you're moving the things around, you get different dots and different divination. How many dials do you see there? If every one of them corresponds to one leg of an opele, to mark one side of a sign, how many opeles would you need for this machine to show all the information? You need like 10 opeles to mark the equal amount of information. This is a very intricate machinery in 1241 after Christ. Before even the Spanish had even arrived to the New World, they already had these divination devices. This is in the British Museum. This whole book is dedicated to that. This is the machine inside. If you take the plate off, this is what the machine looks inside. Look at the dials. Look at the signs. If you get close to it, I can even read Owani, Ofung. I can read some of them. Look. And here's the inscription. It says basically, view of inside of geomantic device with back removed. British Museum. The Arabs in 1241 had a machine that all the divination signs we ascribe to Ifa that we mark very primitively into sand or into earth. They were using machines. They weren't using rustic wooden tablets. They weren't using seeds from trees around one another from one's environment. They had elaborate metal machines with multiple dials with the same signs. Who taught who? The more advanced or the primitive man? Let's be real. Let's be real. This is in a British Museum. This is not invented. Let's be real. Now, when we take an investigation, the maker and the owner, there was an inscription that said that it was the work of Muhammad ibn Kutluk al-Musuli, and this man created it when? 1241 after Christ. This machine is what? Like 800 years old? 800 years old. Before the Yorubans, before Oduduwa even had arrived to Yorubaland, this machine existed, which tells us that these machines existed for a long time. Look at the elaborate Arabic words. It looks like there's Obara on the dial, right? If we can read it good. Here I can read it also. Here I can read Oyekun in the dial. The little bit I can read. Look at the dials. Look at the elaborate work. Here's another photo, a closer photo of what seems to be the center and the right of it. Look at the Meiji signs. Look at the geomantic signs. You can read them. Oyekun, Ofun, Ogbe, Okana. I can read some of them. Some of them I can read, or some of those I can't. Look at the dials. Look at the elaborate work. 1241. 50 to 100 years before Oduduwa even touched Yoruba land. And you're telling me the Nigerians developed the geomantic figures? That it's the origin of Ifa is Nigerian? Please. 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 Look at this. We got here what? Ofun, Odi, Iroso, Ogbe, Ika, Otura, Obara, and Osa. And Obara over here, right? If we're reading it kind of like this way, right? We're reading the top over there, going around this way. Look at the elaborate work of this device. Amazing. Just purely amazing. And this is in the British Museum. 1241. Now here's just basically an inscription on the large rotating dials, and basically the explanation of what each sign meant. So when somebody asked me if they had information affixed to the geomantic figures, yeah, there was omens, there was confusion, it was mixed, increasing good fortune. There was explanations to these signs, and they weren't called Dotura, Irete, Ofung. They were called other names: Al Faudala, Al Bayad, Al Tariq, which is Ogbe, Nasrik, Dakila, which is Owani. And here's the other side, all the remaining 16 Meis. In Arabic geomancy, in a device 1241. And we know that geomancy had reached Spain in more primitive forms from the Arab world for 1900 and 1000 after death. We saw that in Cordova and the Emirate of Cordova in Spain. Let's summarize. I think it's pretty obvious. I mean, the anthropological community is in consensus about this. The Arabs passed on divination, the 16 major figures, the basic figures of Ifa divination, to the Dahomeyan people and to the Yoruba people, roughly, it seems, according to the Alafin, around the 1500s, the 16th century. Before that, Odudua arrived in 1300, 1350 after death. By 1241, there was that machine that was so elaborate, much more advanced than a wooden tray, carved from a tree and using primitive seeds from a local tree and a cane tree to mark signs. The divination system of the Yorubas was primitive in nature in comparison to such an elaborate machine like that, which is in the British Museum. That doesn't mean that whether we use a very advanced machinery or we use a primitive system, because we in Cuba still use the primitive system that we learned from the Yoruba, it doesn't mean that it won't work. Yes, it will work. It will mark the signs on the tray. Ultimately, this can be brought down to a very primitive sand cutting, or earth marking level. But it does mean that you can't have a culture with a machine like that and another culture at the same time, which is in comparison more primitive, and say that the primitive culture taught the Arabs. That's an argument that I've heard from some Isesa believers, because the last province of a person who doesn't want to accept proof and arguments is to say outrageous things. I don't think anybody believes that. I think it's very clear. Our logic dictates that the Arabs, as a more advanced civilization, taught it to the Yorubas as they make contact with them from different sources. You guys remember seeing the maps from the north of Africa, coming from Egypt and Khartoum, etc. That's our logic, but not only is our logic, it's established anthropological consensus. I am daring any person who says, Rene, you're wrong. Okay, good. That's the nature of debate. I would like to dare any person to bring an equal amount of anthropological researchers of the same weight, with the same respect, that bring us information that prove that Nigeria developed Ifa, that counters the proof that I just showed. I think it's pretty clear that the Arabs were the ones who informed Nigeria, and Nigeria created their own diasporic version of Ifa. And that's okay. It's fine that developed their own version. I'm not against it. What we can't say anymore is that Nigeria is the origin and the source of Ifa. I think it's pretty clear that the Arabs had it first. Iboru, Iboya Bocheche. I hope you guys learned a lot.